Freedom represents the foundation of the United States. But do we really understand what it means? Welcome, I'm Jim Falk. In today's program, we ask, is freedom an idea or a way of life? Is it in danger? Is it stagnant? Or does it continuously evolve? We know that countries that were once considered free are no longer. If that has happened elsewhere, is it a risk that we too in the United States must consider? And if so, how do we ensure that our grandchildren enjoy the same freedoms that all of us perhaps take for granted? The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution identifies four essential freedoms: freedom of religion, speech, freedom of assembly, and to petition the government, and freedom of the press. Over the next several months, Perspectives Matter will dive very deeply into a discussion of the freedoms that underpin our democracy. Today, we're going to narrow our discussion to freedom of speech. Can freedom be measured? Can it be categorized? The American Institute for Economic Research is a libertarian think tank. They think it can, and for almost 2 decades has issued a report ranking economic and personal freedom for each of our 50 states. Bringing their expertise to this important topic, let's welcome our two guests. Coming to us from Austin is Laura Prather. She heads the media practice group at the law firm Haynes and Boone. She's a specialist in First Amendment law. She was recently named a Fulbright Scholar, where she worked with Reporters Without Borders, helping to educate on the pros and cons of freedom of expression laws in not just the United States, but also the European Union, advocating for greater protections globally. Jason Sorens is a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. That's a libertarian think tank based in Barrington, Massachusetts. He earned his doctorate in political science at Yale University, and his research has focused on housing policy, land use regulation, fiscal federalism, and U.S. state politics. So great to have both of you with us. What an interesting topic, especially now. So, Jason, I'd like to start with this conversation this way. And I usually don't do it by reading something that's quite as long, but let me do it. And could I ask each of you to comment on the following quote from Timothy Snyder? Jason, you'll like this because he's a professor at Yale. And in his recent book on freedom, he states, "Freedom is the great American commitment," adding, "We've lost sight of what it means, and this is leading us into a crisis." He goes on to say, "Too many of us look at freedom as the absence of state power. We think we're free if we can do and say as we please, and protect ourselves from government overreach. But true freedom isn't so much freedom from as freedom to, the freedom to thrive, to take risks for futures we choose by working together. Freedom is the value that makes all other values possible." Jason, how do you interpret what Dr. Snyder has said?
I partly agree and partly disagree. I would say that freedom from and freedom to are two sides of the same coin. So your freedom to speak also implies a freedom from being punished for speaking. So I would say that our freedom from undue state interference is very important. So is our freedom from attack by criminals, right? So it's not just government, true, that we need to worry about as a threat to our freedom. But around the world today, I would say government is a significant limiting factor for our freedom to speech, our freedom to trade, our freedom to hire whom we want. In many countries, our freedom to marry whom we want. These are limited by government policies.
All right. And Laura, how do you see it?
I agree with Jason, and I guess I would just take it one step further. I think that we can't take for granted any of our freedoms. We essentially, in the U.S., we are very fortunate because we have them ingrained in our Constitution and in our First Amendment, but we cannot assume that we will always have those freedoms. And we have to protect them jealously, the freedom to speak, the freedom to assemble, the freedom to petition. If we don't protect those freedoms and continue to have those freedoms, every other freedom will cascade away.
Jason, let's spend a little bit of time talking about what your study is, because you have done a lot of analysis on all 50 states.
Yeah, so we do think that that we should try to measure freedom as objectively as we can. We know that some countries are freer than others. It would be nice to try to figure out, at the state level in the U.S., are states increasing or decreasing in freedom? Which states allow for more freedom than others? And what are the effects of freedom? And so we've been doing this study since 2009. And I've come out with 7 editions now where we measure freedom across 250 different policies. And we are just looking at the extent to which state and local governments respect people's freedom by not interfering with them, right? So allowing people to exercise their lives, their liberty, their property as they see fit, so long as they aren't infringing on the same rights of other citizens. But the Cato Institute is the institution that publishes our work, and we have a good working relationship between the two organizations.
Where does Texas rank in your study?
So Texas is number 17 in overall freedom, and Texas is maybe the most extreme example of a kind of classic red state in that Texas does very, very well on economic freedom. And unfortunately, it is the last place state on personal freedom. And so when you add those two together, Texas ends up being somewhat above average. And that probably explains why a lot of people are moving to Texas. It's been a place that's attracted a lot of Americans, but that doesn't mean there isn't room for improvement.
So that surprises me that you say that Texas is not ranked so highly on personal freedom. What are some of the elements that are included in that?
So the number one category in personal freedom is incarceration and arrest. It's criminal justice policies, and in particular, the extent to which the state is incarcerating and arresting people for victimless crimes. So for adults, drug use, liquor laws, gambling, gun laws. So those sorts of violations, if your state is incarcerating and arresting a lot of people for those things, it does poorly. But we include many other measures in personal freedom. We include gambling laws, economic freedom, not economic freedom, education freedom, and school choice, for example, which Texas does not have yet. We include all sorts of things like, can you buy raw milk? Can you drive without wearing your seatbelt if you're an adult?
Oh, so so New Hampshire is number 1. So does that mean you can drive in New Hampshire without a seatbelt?
Actually, New Hampshire is the only state where you can drive without a seatbelt if you're over 18. So New Hampshire is.
I said that facetiously.
Well. Yeah. No, it's actually true. And New Hampshire does well on both personal and economic freedom. It's not the number 1 state on either category. Nevada is actually our number 1 personal freedom state. And I believe Florida is our number 1 economic freedom state. But because New Hampshire does well on both, it ends up number 1 on overall freedom.
Laura, I know you had a chance to look at this study. How do you see it? What's the value of it?
Well, I think that it's very valuable in many ways, but I think that there are some things that are missing from it that go back to my opening statements, which is really an analysis of how well each of these states protect those fundamental freedoms that are contained in the First Amendment. New Hampshire, for instance, does not have what's called an anti-SLAPP law, and those laws are there to protect people from speaking out.
I'm going to have to ask you to explain what SLAPP is.
Sure. So SLAPP is an acronym. It's been around since the late 80s, and it stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. And these are essentially lawsuits that are brought to silence someone for speaking out. It's not to right a wrong, but it's really just to suppress someone's speech or their petitioning activities. And strikingly, New Hampshire does not have such a law. I would encourage the study to start incorporating that into the work that they're doing. And I will tell you, there is an extreme example out of New Hampshire that can help shed some light on this. There's an investigative reporter who works at New Hampshire Public Radio that was sued for uncovering rampant abuse in the addiction treatment facility system there. And she was sued for the investigative reporting that she did That investigative reporting was accurate, and it did a public service by uncovering this wrongdoing. But without any sort of an anti-SLAPP law, she was really pressed to be able to defend this case. And it's a case that she was supported by New Hampshire Public Radio, and so she was fortunate, unlike freelance journalists who don't have that kind of infrastructure to support them. But the case went even further because this particular reporter ended up having her home, her manager's home, and her parents' home vandalized by the people that were suing her, making threats to her. And so we talk about sort of domestic terrorism, we talk about terrorism abroad, and that is coming to the US in the form of horrible acts that are being taken against the media and against journalists who are uncovering wrongdoing. And this is just one example. I would suggest that Lauren Chulgin, the investigative reporter at issue, had her personal freedom at issue when her parents are asking her, please stop doing what you're doing. It is too dangerous to do it where we live.
So
that is a striking example.
You're not just talking about journalists. It also can affect members of the general public too, can't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we see this in instances, I would say the most common instances are instances involving petitioning over human rights issues, over issues involving environmental disputes, citizens who are speaking out about things that are happening in their communities. And those citizens need to have this protection to be able to continue to inform the public, and for the public to be able to continue to to be able to continue to have informed decisions about what they're doing.
You know, one of the things that, of course, has grown in so much more influence is social media, that they're really not the guardrails. Anybody can post whatever they want, and without any editorial oversight. How does that affect what you are looking at?
You know, I think that there are significant problems. There is an unequal playing field in that broadcast journalists have licensing requirements that they have to go through. Journalists that have gone through training and significant education and really work within a code of ethics that are not being imposed upon, for instance, social media influencers or the social media streaming platforms. And really the general public is left in a position where they are unaware of who to trust. And so there's part of this can be solved by leveling those playing fields, and part of it can be solved by educating the public about who to trust and where to go to get their information.
Jason, you and I talked earlier about property rights, which is one of the key factors that you look at. And you gave me an example of someone who might be an owner of a mall and how that might affect someone who wanted to come in and make a political statement. Would you elaborate on that? I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, so it's a very, very small part of our index, but we added it because there was interest in it. And that is whether private property must allow for political speech. So there are a few states that require shopping malls and neighborhood associations to allow for political speech in the form of pamphleting or posting political signs, things like that. We actually consider those restrictions, those laws, as a diminution of freedom because they prevent a private property owner from controlling their own property. So, for instance, we would see First Amendment rights as championing your right to speak using the platforms that people are willing to give you access to, right? So the First Amendment doesn't mean that you can say whatever you want on social media. It should be up to the owner of that platform to decide what you're allowed to say. We don't think it should mean that you can say what you want on someone else's property. It means you can say what you want using your own property or people who are willing to let you speak there.
It's a slippery slope in many ways, isn't it, Laura?
I think it is. And the First Amendment is there to protect against the government interference of your right to speak freely and your right to petition and your right to assemble. But what we're seeing more and more is the court system being used in a manner to harass and to silence people who are speaking out about public concerns. And without having access to that information, we don't have an informed citizenry. We can't solve problems together. We can't make informed decisions. And that's both sides of the equation that need to be considered.
I mean, in a sense, you're saying that the judicial system has been weaponized in a way, to use that word that we're hearing so much, that someone with resources is at an advantage against someone who might be a freelance journalist or a small business person.
I think that's exactly what's happening. And I think these anti-SLAPP laws that I mentioned before are a way to re-level the playing field, but they only exist in 34 states in the US and the District of Columbia. And so there's still a long way to go. And hopefully we can get other states like New Hampshire that don't have those laws to pass them, so that citizens there can feel like they can speak freely, and get a federal law passed as well, so that people can't forum shop and just decide, well, I'm going to go file a RICO claim, which involves triple damages for people who may be just petitioning over an issue that they feel passionately about. And then they are essentially sued into silence because there is no federal protection against this sort of weaponization.
What is the justification that you hear from states and legislators that are against this anti-SLAPP legislation?
Well, it's not even so much that they are against it. I do think that there is an argument to be made that certainly people have the right to a trial. They have the right under our Constitution to an open court system and the right to a jury trial. There is no right to bring a meritless claim against someone. That is absolutely not a right in our judicial system. And so that's the distinction. In many ways, it's not that folks are opposed to it, it's more that they're not educated about it. And so the Uniform Law Commission in 2020 passed a model anti-SLAPP law, and that law is being passed state by state, and it is being brought to a jurisdiction near you. So that is something that, be on the lookout for, and please embrace in your jurisdiction if you don't have one.
Jason, how do you see this?
Yeah, I actually agree entirely, and this is probably something we will end up adding to the index. We have thought about it before. We just haven't put it in, but our next edition should be coming out late next year. So keep an eye out. It may well be in there.
I suspect Laura will be able to help guide you on some of the research. Laura,
Right.
What is the Texas Citizens Participation Act?
The Texas Citizens Participation Act is Texas's version of an anti-SLAPP law. And it's been around since 2011, and it has helped countless Texas citizens be able to fight back against these claims that have been brought to try to silence them. I will tell you, Jim, unfortunately, it feels like every session we go up against large business and more well-moneyed interest in trying to pull back the protections of the anti-SLAPP law. Right now, we're fighting an effort that would force citizens to fight on two fronts, where they would have to fight in the trial and the appellate court at the same time. And obviously, you're talking about a freelance journalist, you're talking about an average citizen. They certainly cannot withstand that kind of economic pressure, nor can our court systems sustain that kind of overburden that they are going to incur if they're having to endure the same litigation on two fronts simultaneously. So, these are things that you have to stay vigilant about. Again, I go back to the top of the discussion. We can't take these rights for granted, and we have to protect them jealously.
Is this a red-blue issue when you talk about the 34 states?
No, it's not. That's what's sort of fascinating about this, because this really is. It's a law that protects everyday citizens. It's a law that keeps court systems from being clogged with unnecessary litigation. So in
Yeah,
many ways, it's not reform.
I hear you on that, but the states that have passed it, strong legislation, do they typically be on one side of the aisle or not?
No, no, no,
No,
no.
okay.
So California
Mm-hmm.
has had the law for decades. Texas has had the law since 2011. Oklahoma has passed the law. Washington State. I mean, it is not a red or blue state issue, and it's because of that sort of tripod of benefits: the citizens, the tort reform, and the enshrining of those free speech rights.
Jason, do you do any work with other countries to evaluate their freedoms?
I don't personally work on that. There are a couple of other indices out there that look at freedom around the world. The most significant one is probably the Cato Institute's Human Freedom Index. That, like our index, tries to bring in both economic freedom and personal freedom. And as you might imagine, the range of freedom among countries is much greater than among states. We don't want to claim that any state in our country is anywhere near as bad as a North Korea or a Russia or a Zimbabwe or places like that. Places where your physical integrity rights are at risk, where you are at risk of arbitrary detention and even execution by the government. Those are places where freedom is very low indeed.
It would really be interesting to see the trends, say, in a country like Hungary, which has been leaning towards a liberal democracy for sure. Do you see changes in various states, and how abrupt are they?
They're usually not abrupt, but we do see trends over time, sometimes depending on kind of the shifting of partisan winds even. That can cause a policy change. For instance, in West Virginia, it's a state that moved from sort of deep blue to deep red over the last 25 years. And we have seen policy change as a result of that, including labor market reforms, tax reforms, education reforms that are more consistent with kind of its more conservative position now. So we do see some evidence that that states will change, especially on economic freedom, as a result of changing ideology and political control. Wisconsin is another example. It's actually our state that since 2010 has increased the most on economic freedom, and that's probably a result of some of the governors and legislatures that it has elected over those years.
You may not quite be the U.S. News and report on college rankings, but do you find that corporations look at this when they're thinking about perhaps moving to a different state?
We have done some talks at kind of corporate citing conferences and things like that, and one of the messages that we get is that the most important things for business are workforce, availability of land, and those sorts of things. And we absolutely grant that. But on the margin, policy does make a difference. So if you're choosing between two locations that are roughly equal in terms of quality of the workforce and suitability of the land, but they have different policies in terms of how they might affect your business, whether that's business taxes or various regulations like labor regulations, that probably does make a difference in terms of where businesses choose to go. And that probably is one of the reasons why you see differences in states' growth rates over time, right? And which states create more employment than others.
Laura, I don't want us to end the program without asking you to tell us a little bit more about the work that you do that as a Fulbright, and especially with the EU. Are you seeing more anti-SLAPP activities, say, in France than before? And
So the work that I did as a Fulbright was actually helping to inform them about our anti-SLAPP laws and the protections that we offer here, and enable them to be able to draft and introduce anti-SLAPP legislation there. And I'm pleased to say that the Council of Europe and the EU Council have both, in April of 2024, issued anti-SLAPP directives that are being implemented throughout all the member states over the course of the next 2 years. And a lot of that work was done through the Coalition Against Slaps in Europe, which has been tracking the slap cases that have occurred in Europe. And they have been increasing, much like we've seen in the US. And that increase has been incredibly troubling. And so in order to address that, this legislation needs to be implemented in the member states and is in the process of being done so.
Tell me briefly about how an individual can protect themselves from slap.
I think the first thing that you can do, especially if you're a reporter, is get your facts right. That's one thing. Another thing is there are a myriad of pro bono organizations out there that if you end up becoming a victim of a slap suit, that will help defend you. The Reporters Committee for Free Press has an organization called ProJourn. We are a partner with them that helps to defend against slap suits. The Public Participation Project here in the United States and Protect the Protest also offer pro bono support. So there are a number of support organizations, but really, dot your I's and cross your T's before you publish anything, because the internet is ubiquitous, and that's
important. And here's a statistic that I don't think will make any of us too happy. Just recently, the Pew Research Center found that 37% of adults regularly get their news from influencers on social media. Want to thank both of you, Laura, Jason. Thanks so much for being with us today. Really appreciate you coming onto the program. And we've heard compelling views on the important, I'd say essential role that freedom has for our country and the role that it plays in our daily lives. It may at times seem to be amorphous, shapeless, but as we've heard, there are concrete measures that give it its body. And like all bodies, it needs care to be healthy and alive. Thank you for joining this conversation where we talk about things that matter with people who care.